Timbuktu. You have likely heard the name before, perhaps used casually to mean somewhere impossibly far away, a place of remoteness at the edge of imagination. Yet Timbuktu was never a mythical place. It was a real city, and for centuries, it was one of the most important centers of learning, trade, and spiritual life in West Africa. In its streets, under the shade of mud brick mosques, scholars once gathered, manuscripts were copied by hand, and the stars were catalogued with care that would outlast empires. But to understand how Timbuktu became a city of scholars, you must begin with its geography. It sits at the edge of the Sahara, where the desert gives way to the greener, more fertile regions watered by the Niger River. This location was no accident. Caravans carrying salt from the mines of Taoudeni passed through here on their way south, while gold, ivory, and slaves moved north toward the Mediterranean world. To the west, trade routes linked Timbuktu with the Atlantic coast, and to the east, long desert paths led to Cairo and beyond. Timbuktu was at once isolated and connected, a paradoxical city whose importance lay in being both at the center of the world and at its margins. The story of its scholars cannot be separated from these caravans. Salt, that seemingly dull mineral, was as valuable as gold in certain times and places. Without it, food could not be preserved, survival in the desert was impossible, and economies faltered. It was salt that drew merchants northward and gold that lured them southward. And as merchants moved, so too did ideas. Books, often more valuable than gold, were traded as precious cargo. A scholar in Timbuktu might own a library copied painstakingly by hand, a collection passed down through generations, containing works of astronomy, law, mathematics, medicine, and poetry. These libraries became the lifeblood of the city. The great mosques of Timbuktu Jingreber, Sankore, and Sidi Yahya were not only places of worship but also centers of scholarship. Imagine walking into Sankore in the 15th century. The walls were of sun-baked mud plastered smooth, with wooden beams jutting outward, casting sharp shadows under the relentless Saharan sun. Inside, students sat cross-legged on mats, copying texts word by word as their teachers dictated. The process was slow, repetitive, and precise. To miscopy a verse of law or a formula of calculation was to disrupt knowledge itself. Accuracy mattered more than speed. It was, in every sense, boring work. Yet it was this very work that preserved entire bodies of learning. One of the most enduring subjects studied in Timbuktu was astronomy. To you today, astronomy might conjure images of telescopes, observatories, and galaxies. But in Timbuktu, astronomy was both practical and spiritual. The scholars charted the movements of the stars not only to satisfy curiosity, but to determine the correct times for prayer, to calculate the lunar calendar, and to navigate the desert. In a land where the horizon stretched endlessly and landmarks were scarce, the stars were guides, silent companions on journeys of trade and pilgrimage. The manuscripts that survive from Timbuktu often appear modest thin volumes, ink faded, pages worn. Yet within them, scholars recorded the movement of the planets, eclipses, and the calculation of the Qibla, the direction of Mecca for prayer. These were not abstract musings but matters of daily life and faith. It is worth pausing here, imagining a scribe bent over a page, the flickering light of an oil lamp casting long shadows, as he carefully traces Arabic script in black ink. The ink itself was made from soot, gum Arabic, and water, a recipe passed down for generations. The paper often came from North Africa or Europe, carried across deserts on camelback, folded and cut to size. Every page was a connection between distant worlds. And yet the work was not glamorous. Cataloging the stars required tables, calculations, and endless copying. It was a matter of columns and rows, numbers stacked beside names of constellations. A student might spend months transcribing a single text, checking calculations against older copies, verifying alignments with the heavens. There is in such work a certain monotony, but in the monotony was preservation. By the 16th century, Timbuktu had become legendary across the Islamic world. Stories reached Europe of a city where libraries were as abundant as houses, where scholars debated law and philosophy late into the night. The tales were often exaggerated, but they carried a core of truth. Timbuktu's wealth was not only in its gold or salt, but in its learning. Its scholars wrote thousands of works, from theological treatises to practical manuals. Astronomy, again, stood out as a subject where science, religion, and survival converged. When you picture Timbuktu, imagine its dusty streets, the bleating of goats, the voices of merchants haggling over cloth and salt. Imagine also the quieter corners where manuscripts were copied, rolled, and stored in leather satchels, or tucked into niches in earthen walls. Think of the families who guarded these texts through centuries, even when wars, invasions, and colonial disruptions threatened their survival. Many manuscripts survived because they were considered family treasures, wrapped in cloth, buried in chests, and hidden away. It is perhaps tempting to see the story of Timbuktu's scholars as one of golden brilliance, of wisdom preserved against all odds. Yet the truth is more ordinary and perhaps more meaningful. It was a story of daily labor, of ink stains on fingers, of the ache of sitting too long on mats, of reciting lines until memorized, of making copies upon copies so that knowledge might endure. The stars that Timbuktu's scholars catalogued are the same stars you see tonight. They shine with the same cold light, indifferent to human affairs. And yet, through the tedious work of scholars in a desert city, humanity's relationship to those stars was made practical, understandable, and enduring. But what was it, really, that made Timbuktu into a center of scholarship when so many desert towns faded into obscurity? Why did manuscripts multiply here and not elsewhere? If the first thing you must picture about Timbuktu is its geography, the dusty streets, the endless desert, and the pull of the Niger River, the second is its people, and more precisely, its scholars. For a city to become a center of learning, it needs teachers, and Timbuktu drew them from across the Sahel, the Maghreb, and beyond. They came to study, to teach, and to copy. They came not in search of gold or salt, but in search of something quieter and perhaps more enduring: knowledge. At the heart of this scholarly world were the libraries. These were not libraries in the sense you may imagine today, with shelves neatly lined and catalogs cross-referenced. They were collections held by families, often housed in wooden chests, leather satchels, or small alcoves built into the walls of homes. A single family might possess hundreds of manuscripts, passed down through generations. Some families traced their lineage back to scholars who had studied in Cairo or Fez, bringing with them texts that enriched the intellectual life of Timbuktu. Others specialized in copying works, ensuring that popular texts circulated widely among students. The manuscripts themselves varied in subject and style. Some were slim treatises on astronomy, consisting of little more than tables of numbers accompanied by brief notes on planetary movements. Others were theological works, dense with commentary. There were medical texts, legal rulings, poetry, and chronicles of local history. Collectively, these manuscripts formed an intellectual map of the Islamic world, transplanted into the Sahel. To understand the scholars of Timbuktu, you must understand the curriculum they followed. Much of it was rooted in Islamic scholarship, drawing on texts written in Arabic. At Sankore University, a student would begin with the Quran and its commentaries, then progress to law, grammar, and rhetoric. Advanced students might turn to mathematics, astronomy, or medicine. The study of astronomy, in particular, carried both practical and spiritual weight. To determine the prayer times precisely, one needed to know the movement of the sun across the sky. To calculate the start of Ramadan or the timing of Eid, one needed to track the moon. Navigation across the desert demanded familiarity with the stars, which served as a compass when no landmarks could be found. Imagine a lesson on astronomy in Timbuktu. The teacher sits cross-legged, a manuscript open before him. Around him, students lean forward, copying the words carefully. He explains the method of determining latitude by measuring the angle of the North Star, or how to calculate the Qibla, the direction of Mecca, from Timbuktu's longitude and latitude. To you, these calculations may seem routine, even tedious. But in an age without mechanical clocks, compasses, or reliable maps, they were vital. The accuracy of prayer times, the success of a caravan, even the organization of markets depended on them. The scholars of Timbuktu were not isolated. They corresponded with scholars in Morocco, Egypt, and the Middle East. Caravans carried not only salt and gold but also books and letters. A newly copied text might travel from Fez to Timbuktu, where it would be studied, commented on, and copied again. In this way, Timbuktu became a node in a vast intellectual network that spanned the Islamic world. Its scholars read works by Aristotle and Ptolemy, transmitted through Arabic translations, and they adapted this knowledge to their own context. They were not passive recipients of knowledge. They debated, argued, and wrote commentaries that added new layers of meaning. One particularly significant scholar was Ahmed Baba, 1556–1627, often remembered as one of Timbuktu's greatest intellectuals. He was a jurist, theologian, and prolific writer. He lived during a time of upheaval, when Moroccan forces invaded Timbuktu in 1591, disrupting its scholarly life. Ahmed Baba himself was exiled to Morocco, where he continued to write and teach. His works reflect the resilience of Timbuktu's intellectual tradition, even in the face of political and military disruption. To him, knowledge was not merely for personal advancement. It was a collective inheritance to be preserved and passed on. The work of copying and cataloging manuscripts was central to this preservation. Picture the tools of a Timbuktu scribe: a reed pen cut to a fine point, a small pot of ink, sheets of imported paper, and a flat wooden board to write on. The scribe sits patiently, dipping his pen, tracing lines of Arabic script across the page. His task is repetitive but exacting. A single misplaced stroke could alter a word's meaning. Each manuscript was thus both a work of art and a vessel of knowledge. Margins often carried notes, commentary, corrections, or glosses, traces of generations of readers interacting with the text. Astronomical manuscripts, in particular, often included diagram circles representing the orbits of planets, charts aligning the phases of the moon with months of the calendar. Some manuscripts contained instructions for making astrolabes, devices used to measure the altitude of celestial bodies. To hold one of these manuscripts is to glimpse a world where the stars were not distant abstractions, but tools of survival and devotion. And yet, much of this work was deeply ordinary. A student might spend hours memorizing lists of star names, copying columns of numbers, or reciting formulas for calculating the Qibla. There is little drama in such tasks, but in their very ordinariness lies their importance. Knowledge survives not only through great discoveries, but through the persistence of routine labor. The libraries of Timbuktu were not static. Manuscripts were borrowed, traded, copied, and sometimes lost. Families guarded their collections jealously, aware of their value. During times of conflict, manuscripts were hidden away, buried in the sand, or sealed in trunks. In the 20th and 21st centuries, when war once again threatened Timbuktu, families repeated these practices, smuggling manuscripts out of the city to protect them. The survival of so many texts is a testament not to kings or empires, but to ordinary people who considered these manuscripts worth saving. It is important, too, to recognize what Timbuktu was not. It was not a city of monumental stone buildings or imperial capitals. Its architecture was modest, built of mud and timber. Its power was not military but intellectual. The wealth of Timbuktu lay in its manuscripts, its teachers, and its students. This wealth was fragile, dependent on trade routes, political stability, and the dedication of families to preserve their libraries. So when you think of Timbuktu, do not think only of exotic legends or golden myths. Think of the quiet work of cataloging the columns of numbers, the pages of copied text, the manuscripts wrapped in cloth and stored away for safekeeping. Think of the scholars who sat for hours under the flickering light of lamps, aligning the heavens with the rhythms of daily life. And yet a question remains. Timbuktu's scholars catalogued the stars, debated law, and preserved knowledge for centuries. But what happened when the world around them changed, when empires rose and fell, when invasions disrupted trade, when new centers of power emerged elsewhere? Did the libraries of Timbuktu continue to thrive, or did they fade into obscurity, their manuscripts left unread in dusty trunks? By the late 16th century, Timbuktu's golden age as a hub of scholarship was waning. Its decline was not sudden, nor was it absolute, but it was unmistakable. The Moroccan invasion of 1591 shattered the political structures that had protected the city and its intellectual life. Moroccan troops, seeking control of the trans-Saharan trade, brought with them guns and foreign rule. Scholars were arrested, exiled, or silenced. Among them was Ahmed Baba, whose exile to Morocco symbolized the dispersal of Timbuktu's scholarly elite. The city remained inhabited, its mosques still active, but the atmosphere of vibrant debate and manuscript production began to diminish. Trade, too, shifted. The rise of Atlantic commerce drew wealth and attention away from the desert routes. Europeans along the coasts of West Africa traded directly for gold, bypassing the caravans that had once sustained Timbuktu. The Sahara, once a bridge between North and West Africa, became more of a barrier. The city's isolation grew, and with isolation came obscurity. Yet obscurity did not mean disappearance. Families continued to guard their manuscripts, passing them down through generations. Some manuscripts lay untouched in trunks, their pages yellowing, their ink fading, but they were never discarded. To own a manuscript in Timbuktu was to own a piece of one's heritage, a symbol of scholarly lineage and family pride. Even in decline, the idea of Timbuktu as a city of learning persisted, preserved not in bustling universities, but in the quiet secrecy of private homes. For centuries, Timbuktu remained more legend than reality in the outside world. European explorers, hearing tales of a city rich in gold and wisdom, sought it out. When they finally arrived in the 19th century, they found not a city of glittering riches but a modest settlement of mud brick houses. Many dismissed it as a disappointment. They could not see the manuscripts hidden in trunks or tucked away in alcoves. They could not see the layers of history inscribed in ink and paper. It was only in the 20th century that the true scale of Timbuktu's manuscript heritage began to emerge. Scholars and librarians cataloged tens of thousands of surviving texts, scattered across private collections and family libraries. Some families opened their collections to researchers, while others kept them hidden, wary of theft or exploitation. Slowly, Timbuktu's reputation as a city of gold transformed into something perhaps more valuable, a city of books. The manuscripts themselves are remarkable not for their grandeur but for their ordinariness. Many are written in simple script on inexpensive paper. They lack the gilded illuminations of European medieval manuscripts. And yet, within their plain pages lies a vast array of knowledge. Treatises on astronomy, theology, medicine, law, poetry, and commerce. One manuscript might list star charts used to calculate prayer times. Another might record legal rulings on trade disputes. A third might contain herbal remedies for common ailments. Collectively, they reveal a society deeply invested in learning, one where scholarship was woven into daily life. For modern historians, the Timbuktu manuscripts challenge long-standing narratives. Too often, Africa has been portrayed as a continent without written history, its past preserved only through oral traditions. The manuscripts of Timbuktu refute this myth. They show that West Africa had a rich written tradition, connected to the broader Islamic world, engaged in debates about science, law, and philosophy. They remind us that literacy and scholarship were not confined to Europe or the Middle East, but flourished in the Sahel as well. The survival of these manuscripts into the modern era is itself a story of resilience. In times of war, families hid them in sand dunes, buried them in courtyards, or smuggled them out of the city. During the 2012 crisis in Mali, When Islamist militants occupied Timbuktu, librarians and ordinary citizens risked their lives to move thousands of manuscripts to safety in Bamako, the capital. Trunks were loaded onto carts, cars, and boats, often under cover of night. By the time the militants were driven out, tens of thousands of manuscripts had been saved. This act of preservation was not the work of governments or armies, but of individuals who understood the value of their heritage. And yet questions remain. What will become of these manuscripts in the future? Many are fragile, their ink fading, their paper crumbling. Conservation requires resources, expertise, and stability, things often scarce in Mali. Digital projects have begun, scanning thousands of pages to preserve them electronically. But digitization cannot capture the full weight of history, the texture of paper, the faint scent of ink, the marginal notes added by generations of readers. The manuscripts are more than texts. They are objects, artifacts of a scholarly culture that thrived in the Sahel. As you reflect on Timbuktu's libraries, consider the meaning of their survival. These manuscripts are not monuments of conquest or empire. They are not treasures of gold or silver. They are, instead, the result of centuries of tedious, meticulous labor of copying, reciting, and storing away. Their survival is a reminder that history is often preserved not through dramatic acts, but through the persistence of ordinary routines. The scholars of Timbuktu catalogued the stars, calculated prayer times, and debated the law. They did not seek fame or wealth, but they left behind a legacy that outlasted kingdoms and caravans. Their manuscripts speak across centuries, reminding us that knowledge, once written, has the power to endure. And so you might ask yourself, when future generations look back on our time, what will they find preserved? What fragments of our daily routines will survive to tell our story? If gold is the metal that has dazzled imaginations throughout history, salt is the mineral that has quietly sustained life. It is almost too ordinary to think about grains of white crystal scattered across food, dissolved into soups, tucked into the folds of bread. Yet for centuries, salt was among the most valuable commodities in the world. Without it, people could not preserve meat, cure hides, or replenish the minerals lost in sweat under a hot sun. In the Sahara, where survival was an endless calculation of water and endurance, salt was not a luxury but a necessity. The Sahara Desert itself is vast, over 3.5 million square miles of shifting dunes, rocky plateaus, and barren plains. To cross it is to encounter extremes: blistering heat by day, bone-chilling cold by night, winds that strip the flesh of exposed skin, and horizons that blur into mirages. And yet, for centuries, traders carved paths across this sea of sand. They were drawn not only by the lure of gold in the south, but by the salt mines buried deep within the desert. The most famous of these were the mines of Taludeni, a settlement so remote that even today it seems almost beyond reach. At Taludeni, salt was not collected from seas or evaporated in pans. It was mined from ancient deposits, cut into slabs by hand with iron tools. Imagine the scene. Workers descend into pits carved into the desert floor, hacking at the hard crust of salt, prying loose massive blocks. Each block might weigh as much as 30 kilograms. The work is backbreaking, the sun relentless. Once cut, the slabs are hauled to the surface, stacked in neat piles and loaded onto camels. For every caravan, hundreds of such slabs would be prepared. The salt slabs were not merely chunks of mineral, they were currency. A slab of Taludeni salt was standardized in size, a unit of trade as recognizable in Timbuktu or Gao as a minted coin might be in Rome. Merchants could barter with salt, pay taxes with it, or exchange it for gold, grain, and cloth. In regions far from the mines, a single slab of salt might be worth its weight in gold. But salt alone did not make an empire. It was the movement of salt, its transportation across thousands of miles, that shaped history, and this required caravans. Caravans were not a handful of traders walking with camels. They were enormous, carefully organized expeditions. Some included thousands of camels, each carrying 2 slabs of salt strapped to its sides. The camels themselves were vital. The dromedary, with its single hump, could survive for days without water, enduring heat and thirst that no horse could bear. Without camels, the Sahara could not be crossed. A caravan set out not casually but with precision. Timing was essential. Traders waited for the cooler months when the risk of heatstroke was lower. Routes were chosen carefully, aligning with oases where water and fodder could be found. Guides who knew the desert were indispensable, for a single wrong turn could mean death. The desert is deceptive. Dunes shift, landmarks vanish, mirages confuse the eye. Experienced guides relied on memory, on the stars, and on subtle cues in the landscape to keep their caravans on course. At night, under skies unclouded by moisture or pollution, the stars stretched in endless clarity. It was under these skies that guides read the heavens, aligning their caravans by constellations, the same constellations catalogued by scholars in Timbuktu. In this way, science and survival intertwined. The position of the North Star, the Arc of Orion, the rising of Sirius, these were not abstractions but lifelines. To be wrong was to wander into the desert's vast emptiness. The pace of a caravan was slow, measured not in miles per hour but in the steady plod of camels' hooves. A caravan might cover 20 miles in a day, then rest at an oasis before pressing on. The soundscape was muted, the padding of feet, the creak of leather straps, the occasional cry of a camel, and the low murmur of traders. Days blurred together into a rhythm of walking, resting, and walking again. Boredom, as much as exhaustion, was a challenge. To march across dunes day after day, staring at horizons that never seemed to change, required mental endurance. And yet within this monotony lay commerce and empire. Caravans carried not only salt but also gold from the forests of West Africa, ivory, cola nuts, and slaves. From the north came textiles, glassware, and books. Each caravan was a thread in a web of trade that linked the Sahel to the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and the Middle East. Cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Jenne rose as nodes in this network, their wealth built on the movement of goods across sand. For the merchants, the risks were immense. A caravan could be lost to a sandstorm, attacked by raiders, or weakened by thirst if an oasis failed. Camels might collapse under their loads and salt slabs could shatter. But the rewards outweighed the risks. A successful journey could transform a merchant's fortune, enrich entire communities, and supply empires with the resources they needed to thrive. It is worth pausing to consider the sheer ordinariness of salt in all of this. To you, salt is something you buy cheaply in paper packets or pour from shakers on tables. It is so common that it rarely crosses your mind. But for the empires of West Africa, Mali, Songhai, Ghana, it was the foundation of wealth. Without salt, food spoiled. Armies could not march. Cities could not survive. To control the salt routes was to control the lifeblood of an empire. This explains why kings invested so heavily in securing trade routes, building garrisons, and taxing caravans. Salt was not glamorous like gold, but it was steady, reliable, and essential. The Mali Empire, at its height under Mansa Musa in the 14th century, drew much of its strength from this trade. Mansa Musa himself became legendary in the Islamic world for his wealth, but that wealth rested not only on gold but also on salt. The story of the salt roads is not one of sudden discoveries or dramatic battles. It is a story of routine, men cutting slabs in the desert, camels plodding in line, traders counting and weighing, scribes recording transactions. It is a story of endurance, of repeating the same journeys year after year, sustaining empires one slab of salt at a time. And yet, a question lingers. These caravans carried salt across deserts for centuries, binding together distant regions in a web of trade. But what happened when the world shifted, when ships along the Atlantic coast offered easier routes, when European traders bypassed the desert, when new commodities displaced the old? Could the salt roads survive the weight of history, or were they destined to fade into silence beneath the sands? If the weight of salt carved the paths across the Sahara, it was gold that turned those paths into arteries of empire. The two commodities were bound together, one dull and utilitarian, the other glittering and alluring. Salt moved south, gold moved north, and between them cities and kingdoms rose. The rhythm of this exchange was not sudden or spectacular. It was steady, persistent, and deeply transformative. By the 8th and 9th centuries, long before Timbuktu rose to prominence, the Kingdom of Ghana had already established itself as a major power by controlling trans-Saharan trade. Ghana's rulers stationed officials along the routes, taxing caravans as they entered and left their territory. Traders carrying salt from the Sahara would exchange it for gold dust, collected from the rivers and forests further south. The system was so steady that Arab chroniclers marveled at it, noting how caravans stretched for miles, and how wealth accumulated in the capital of come by sale. When Ghana gave way to the Mali Empire in the 13th century, the structure remained. Mali's rulers inherited the salt roads, and with them the wealth of taxation. Mansa Musa, perhaps the most famous of Mali's kings, understood this well. His legendary pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 was not simply an act of devotion, but also a demonstration of wealth rooted in trade. Contemporary accounts describe him distributing so much gold in Cairo that its value dropped for years. Yet behind this display was a quieter truth. His empire was sustained not only by gold, but by the steady flow of salt caravans taxed at every crossing. To understand how these empires functioned, you must look at the bureaucratic routines that govern trade. Every caravan entering Timbuktu, Gao, or Janneh was inspected. Officials recorded the number of camels, the slabs of salt, the goods carried from the north. Taxes were levied, sometimes in gold dust, sometimes in goods. These records, often kept by scribes trained in Arabic, formed the backbone of imperial revenue. They were not glamorous documents, lists of numbers, names, and weights, but they were essential. Without them, rulers could not maintain armies, build mosques, or sustain courts. In this sense, the salt roads were not just physical paths but administrative systems. To move a caravan required not only guides and camels but also permission, taxes, and trust in the protection of the ruling power. The empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai all relied on this delicate balance. If caravans felt unsafe, if taxes were too high, if routes became unstable, trade would falter. And with it, the wealth of kingdoms. Daily life along the salt roads was shaped by this bureaucracy. A trader might spend days negotiating at a tax station, presenting his goods, haggling over rates, and waiting for scribes to finish their tallies. The process was slow, deliberate, and repetitive, yet it created predictability. Traders knew what to expect, and empires relied on this steady stream of income. The movement of salt also shaped urban life. Cities like Timbuktu became marketplaces where slabs of salt stood stacked in tall piles, gleaming in the sun. Buyers weighed them carefully, breaking off chips to test quality. Gold dust, the preferred currency of the region, was measured with tiny scales, balanced grain by grain. Transactions were not conducted hastily but with patience. A negotiation might stretch over hours, with long pauses, offers, and counteroffers. Trust mattered, and reputation was everything. A dishonest trader could not last long in a system where word traveled with every caravan. It was in these markets that cultures converged. Berber traders from the north met Soninke, Mende, and Songhai merchants from the south. Languages mingled: Arabic, Tamashek, Bambara, creating a linguistic web that carried ideas as well as goods. Alongside salt and gold came books, textiles, beads, and slaves. Caravan routes were not only economic but cultural, bringing Islamic scholarship to West Africa and carrying African products into Mediterranean markets. For ordinary people, the impact of this trade was tangible. Farmers in the Sahel relied on salt to preserve food through dry seasons. Soldiers in imperial armies were paid in part with salt rations. Craftsmen used salt in tanning hides, producing leather that traveled north to Europe. In every case, salt was more than seasoning, it was infrastructure. It supported diets, armies, industries, and ultimately the power of kings. Yet the salt roads were also fragile. Their success depended on political stability, and history rarely grants such stability for long. The fall of Ghana, the rise of Mali, and the eventual dominance of Songhai all reflected shifts in control over trade. Each empire sought to secure the salt routes, and each eventually lost them. Raids, rebellions, and external invasions disrupted the delicate balance. The Moroccan invasion of Songhai in 1591 marked a decisive turning point. Armed with muskets, Moroccan forces defeated Songhai's cavalry at the Battle of Tondibai. Though they captured Timbuktu and Gao, their rule was tenuous. The long supply lines across the desert strained their control, and the salt roads, once steady and secure, became fragmented. Trade continued, but the great empires that had depended on it collapsed into smaller states. Still, caravans did not vanish. Even in decline, the rhythm of camels plodding across the desert endured. For centuries after the fall of Songhai, salt caravans continued to leave Taoudeni, cross the dunes, and arrive in Timbuktu. They were smaller, less profitable, less secure, but they persisted. The desert, indifferent to empires, still demanded salt, and people still needed to move it. What makes the story of the Salt Road so striking is not the sudden rise or fall of empires, but the persistence of routine. Men continued to mine salt, camels continued to carry it, traders continued to negotiate, even as political maps changed around them. History often remembers the dramatic, the battles, the kings, the wealth of Mansa Musa. But beneath those stories lay the daily plot of caravans, the slow accumulation of wealth one slab at a time. And yet another question lingers. The salt roads endured for centuries, sustaining empires and linking distant worlds. But when European ships began to dominate Atlantic trade, carrying goods faster and in greater quantities, what place was left for the slow, plodding caravans of the desert? Could the salt roads adapt, or were they destined to become relics of a vanished age? By the time European ships anchored along the Atlantic coasts of Africa in the 15th and 16th centuries, the balance of trade was shifting. Gold that once traveled north through the Sahara was increasingly diverted to coastal ports. Textiles, beads, and weapons arrived by ship, bypassing the long camel routes. The salt caravans, once central to empires like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, began to seem less essential in the wider economy. But the desert is stubborn, and so were the people who lived within its harshness. Salt did not lose its importance. If anything, in the arid Sahel, it remained indispensable. Cattle herders still needed it for their animals, households still relied on it for preservation, and traders still used it as a form of currency in remote markets. So, even as the Atlantic world grew louder, the desert continued its quiet rhythms. Caravans left Taoudeni, camels plodded southward, and slabs of salt arrived in Timbuktu, stacked in courtyards and exchanged in markets. European explorers of the 19th century, entering the Sahara with romantic ideas of discovering lost cities, were often disappointed when they found the salt caravans. To them, there was nothing glamorous about endless columns of camels carrying dull, gray slabs. They wanted gold, hidden treasures, dramatic ruins. What they encountered instead was monotony. The same journeys repeated across centuries, unchanged except for the faces of the men and the camels. Yet in that monotony lay resilience. Life at the mines of Taoudeni remained grueling. Workers, many of them prisoners or conscripts, labored in pits cut into the desert crust. With simple iron tools, they pried salt into blocks, then lifted them out under a sun that offered no mercy. Water was scarce, food monotonous, and the work unending. Each slab of salt bore the weight of this labor. When loaded onto camels, the slabs were tied with ropes, balanced carefully, and carried mile after mile across the sands. The caravans themselves could stretch for miles. Each camel carried 2 slabs, one on each side, swaying gently as the animals walked. A large caravan might consist of thousands of camels, with merchants, drivers, and guards accompanying them. The rhythm of travel was slow, deliberate, and unchanging. At night, under a sky that revealed the Milky Way in dazzling clarity, the caravan rested near wells or oases. Fires flickered, tea was brewed, and stories were told. Then, at dawn, the march resumed. These caravans were not just economic systems but social worlds. Families organized themselves around the trade. Young men became camel drivers, elders advised on routes, and merchants built reputations over years of successful journeys. Knowledge of the desert was passed orally, landmarks described, wells remembered, constellations learned. The desert itself became a kind of library, its pages written in dunes, rocks, and stars. Yet over time, the salt roads began to shrink. Colonial powers in the 19th and 20th centuries drew new boundaries, established railways, and introduced new forms of currency. Salt could be mined in industrial quantities elsewhere and transported cheaply. The ancient caravans seemed inefficient, relics of a slower age. And still, they did not vanish. Into the 20th century, caravans continued to leave Taludeni, arriving in Timbuktu after weeks of travel. Fewer than before, smaller than before, but still present. Even in the early 21st century, caravans could still be seen. Journalists and photographers documented them, lines of camels stretching across endless sand, men in indigo robes guiding them with quiet patience. The slabs of salt were unloaded in Timbuktu, sold in markets, and distributed across Mali and Niger. The world had changed, planes flew overhead, trucks rumbled along new roads, but the desert still yielded to camels in ways machines could not match. The endurance of the salt roads tells us something about human persistence. Against the extremes of the Sahara, people developed systems of survival that were simple, repetitive, and reliable. These systems did not vanish with empires or with colonial disruption. They adapted, shrank, and persisted. A caravan is not dramatic, but it is steady. A salt slab is not glamorous, but it sustains life. For historians, the salt roads are a reminder that great empires rest on ordinary foundations. The wealth of Mansa Musa, the splendor of Timbuktu, the power of Songhai all depended on slabs of salt cut by hand, camels trudging across dunes, and merchants negotiating in markets. The details are boring in the way much of history is boring. Repetitive tasks, slow processes, unchanging routines. But without them, there would be no grandeur to remember. Today, the salt caravans face new challenges. Climate change threatens the fragile ecosystems of the Sahara. Conflict in northern Mali disrupts trade routes. Trucks, when possible, move salt more quickly than camels ever could. Yet the image of the caravan endures, not only as a symbol of the past, but as a reminder of resilience. If you stand in the desert at night, far from cities, you will see the stars as the caravan guides once did, bright, steady, unclouded. The same constellations that directed traders to Timbuktu shine above you. The caravans may fade, but the memory of their endurance lingers. So you are left to wonder, in a world of speed and instant communication, what lessons remain in the slow, deliberate plod of camels across a desert? Can the patience of the salt roads teach us something about resilience, about the quiet strength of routines that sustain life, long after empires and wealth have disappeared? High in the Andes, where mountains pierce the sky and valleys stretch like ribbons between peaks, the Inca built an empire without writing in the conventional sense. They had no alphabet, no parchment manuscripts, no libraries of books. And yet, they recorded vast amounts of information, censuses of people, inventories of storehouses, records of tribute on bundles of knotted strings called quipus. To you, a quipu might seem deceptively simple. Strands of cotton or camelid fiber dyed in different colors with knots tied at precise intervals. But for the Inca, each knot, each cord, each placement carried meaning. A quipu was not a decoration nor a toy. It was a ledger, a document, a memory device. In a world without written words, it was their archive. The Inca world demanded such records. Stretching along the Andes for more than 2,500 miles, their empire was vast, diverse, and complex. Dozens of ethnic groups, hundreds of local communities, and millions of people were incorporated into the state. To govern such an empire required knowledge. Who lived where, how much maize had been harvested, how many llamas were available for transport, how much labor could be demanded for public works. Without records, chaos would overwhelm order. The quipu was the Inca solution. At its simplest, a quipu worked as a numerical device. The base cord thick and sturdy held pendant strings attached at intervals. Along these pendants, knots were tied in clusters, their positions indicating units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. A trained quipu keeper or quipu could glance at a quipu and read it like an accountant reads a ledger. Each knot spoke a number, each arrangement told a story of quantity. But quipus were not only about numbers. The use of different colors, fibers, and cord arrangements allowed for categories and distinctions. A quipu might record not only the number of people in a village, but also divide them by age, gender, or social class, with each category assigned its own colored cord. Another quipu might track harvest yields, distinguishing maize from potatoes, beans from quinoa. In this way, quipus became multidimensional. Not just numbers but classifications, relationships, and hierarchies encoded in thread. The quipu were central to this system. Chosen for their skill and trained rigorously, they acted as the empire's accountants, record keepers, and bureaucrats. Imagine one sitting in a village square, cords spread before him, fingers deftly tying knots while villagers recite their household sizes, their livestock counts, their obligations of labor. The process was deliberate, repetitive, and precise. Accuracy mattered, for these numbers determine how much tribute a community owed, how much food was stored, or how many soldiers could be conscripted. The empire itself was organized around these records. Along the great roads of the Andes, stone-paved highways that stretched across mountains and valleys, storehouses called calca lined the way. In them, the Inca stored maize, dried potatoes, wool, and weapons. The flow of goods in and out of these storehouses was tracked on quipus. To feed armies, to supply festivals, to respond to droughts, all required reliable records. A quipu was thus as vital to the Inca state as any law or decree. To understand the quipu, you must also understand the Andean landscape. The Andes are not forgiving. The air thins at high altitudes, making every breath a labor. Valleys are narrow, terraces must be carved into mountainsides to grow food, and weather shifts unpredictably. In such a world, surplus was survival. The Inca perfected systems of redistribution, moving food from regions of plenty to regions of scarcity. But redistribution required knowledge. How much was stored in a valley warehouse? How many laborers were available to carry supplies? Quipus answered these questions. They were not abstract tools, they were instruments of survival. Yet there is something mysterious about quipus. Unlike manuscripts, which can be read centuries later, quipus are difficult to interpret without the context of their users. Today, archaeologists and historians study surviving quipus. Hundreds have been preserved. Their cords still intact, but the full system of meaning is elusive. Numbers can be deciphered, but were quipus also narrative, capable of telling stories, histories, and myths? Some scholars argue they were, pointing to Spanish chroniclers who described quipus being used to recount dynastic histories. Others suggest quipus were strictly administrative. The truth may lie somewhere between, a flexible system capable of both numerical precision and symbolic storytelling. For the Inca themselves, however, there was no question. The quipu was their record, their proof, their authority. A tax assessment was not valid until it was knotted onto a quipu. A census was not official until cords recorded the households. When disputes arose, quipus were brought out as evidence. Imagine a village elder contesting the number of laborers his community was assigned. The quipu unrolls the cords, runs his fingers along the knots, and declares the numbers. The cords speak with authority because they embody the empire's memory. And yet, for all their precision, quipus were fragile. Made of fibers, they were vulnerable to decay, to fire, to insects. Unlike stone monuments, they could vanish easily. Their survival depended on constant use, on the hands of quipu passing knowledge to apprentices, on communities maintaining their cords. They were living records, dependent on human memory to interpret them. Without trained readers, a quipu was nothing more than knotted string. It is here that the story becomes both fascinating and fragile. When the Spanish arrived in the Andes in the 16th century, They brought not only steel and gunpowder but also written paper records. They demanded written documents, signed and sealed, not cords of knots. Slowly, the system of quipus unraveled. Many were destroyed, others forgotten. By the time centuries had passed, the meaning of most quipus was lost. The empire they once sustained was gone, and their cords hung silent. And so you are left to wonder, if knots and strings could govern an empire, how much knowledge have we lost in the fibers that can no longer be read? What stories remain tied in cords, waiting for someone to unravel them? To govern millions without writing words on parchment seems impossible, but the Inca achieved it through careful organization. Their empire, Tawantinsuyu, the land of four parts, was vast, stretching from present-day Colombia to Chile, and from the Pacific coast to the Amazon fringe. Such a land could not be ruled by memory alone. Quipus were the empire's silent administrators, the cords binding together distant provinces and the capital at Cusco. The principle of the Inca state was reciprocity. People gave labor, food, and resources to the state, and in return the state provided security, redistribution, and monumental works. But reciprocity required measurement. How much labor could be expected from a village of 200 households? How much maize was owed from terraces in a fertile valley? How many soldiers could be raised in time of war? To answer these questions, the Inca relied on the Quipucamayoc. The Quipucamayoc, literally keepers of the quipu, were trained specialists who served as accountants, statisticians, and bureaucrats. Their skill lay not only in tying knots but in reading them, remembering the categories they represented, and explaining them to officials. To be a Quipucamayoc was a position of trust. Their work determined the flow of goods, the obligations of subjects, and the reports presented to higher officials. A miscount could mean a village starving from overtribute or an army lacking supplies. The daily work of a Quipucamayoc was meticulous. Imagine him seated in a provincial storehouse, surrounded by rows of calca, the state warehouses filled with maize, potatoes, dried meat, and textiles. Each time food was deposited or removed, knots were tied on cords, recording the amount. If 20 baskets of maize were sent to Cusco, a quipu was updated to reflect the deduction. If a shipment of wool arrived from llama herders, knots recorded its arrival. Slowly, knot by knot, the empire's economy was written into thread. The cords themselves were not uniform. Some quipus contained a few dozen pendants, each carrying a string of knots. Others held hundreds of cords, tangled and complex like braided maps of obligation. The use of colors added further meaning. A red cord might signify soldiers, a yellow cord maize, a white cord tribute from highland communities. Fibers, too, carried significance. Cotton cords might record goods from the coast, camelid fibers goods from the highlands. The Quipucamayoc read not only knots but texture, hue, and placement. These cords flowed upward in the administrative hierarchy. Village-level quipus recorded households and harvests. Regional officials gathered these records and presented them to higher administrators, who consolidated them into provincial summaries. At the top, imperial officials in Cusco received the final reports, condensed but detailed, each not a testimony of the labor and produce owed to the Sapa Inca, the emperor. In this way, information traveled without parchment, without ink, without alphabet. The knots themselves carried the empire's weight. The most striking use of quipus was in the census. Every household in the empire was registered, its members counted, its labor obligations noted. Men and women were categorized by age groups, each group owing specific types of service. Young men might be drafted into armies, middle-aged men into construction projects, older men into lighter tasks. Women contributed weaving, food preparation, or ritual services. The census was not just demographic, it was economic, military, and social, all at once. To conduct it required cords long enough to capture the complexity of human life, and Quipucamayoc deft enough to keep categories distinct. For ordinary people, this system was not abstract. When imperial officials visited a village, they brought with them Quipucamayoc. The villagers stood in lines, their households recited, their livestock counted. Knots were tied for each child, each adult, each lama. Tribute was assessed, labor obligations assigned. The quipu became the village's record in the empire's memory. It could not be argued with, for the cords carried authority backed by the state. But quipus were more than static records. They were updated, revised, and cross-checked. The Inca bureaucracy did not rely on a single quipu but on duplication. 2 or 3 quipu kamiok might record the same census, their cords compared for consistency. Inspectors from Cusco traveled provinces to verify quipus, ensuring that local officials had not falsified numbers. This system of redundancy, though slow, created accountability. A quipu was not simply a record, it was a tool of verification. The reliance on quipus shaped the empire's infrastructure. The great roads, stretching thousands of miles, were dotted with way stations called tambos. At these stations, runners known as chasquis carried messages. Some messages were oral, passed memorized from runner to runner. Others were quipus, tied in knots and carried swiftly along the roads. In this way, information could travel hundreds of miles in a matter of days, reaching Cusco from distant provinces faster than a caravan might move goods. Imagine a chasqui arriving breathless at a provincial office, unrolling a quipu delivered from Cusco. The knots conveyed orders. Levy soldiers, send maize, prepare textiles. No parchment was needed. The empire spoke in cords. Yet the system, though functional, had limits. Unlike writing, which can be preserved independently of its reader, quipus depended on human interpreters. Without trained quipu kamiok, the cords were silent. This reliance made the system both flexible and fragile. Flexible, because cords could represent nearly anything with the right conventions. Fragile, because those conventions required living memory. When the Spanish conquest disrupted the empire, many quipu kamiok were killed, silenced, or retrained to keep records for their new rulers. The cords they had tied, once alive with meaning, became mute. Here lies the haunting question. How much did the quipus truly hold? Some scholars argue that they contained only numbers, efficient accounting tools, nothing more. Others suggest that quipus carried narratives, histories, genealogies, even poetry. The Spanish chroniclers described Inca officials reciting dynasties from quipus, telling stories of rulers and battles with cords in hand. But if that was true, how were stories encoded? Were knots arranged not only as numbers but as syllables or words? Could colors and chord placements carry symbolic meaning beyond categories? Without the living quipu kamiok to explain, the answer remains uncertain. What is clear is that the Inca trusted quipus completely. They built an empire on knots, and knots held their economy, their armies, their censuses together. But when the cords lost their readers, they became puzzles to later generations. And so, the question remains unresolved. Were quipus merely ledgers of tribute and food, or were they libraries of history, telling stories we can no longer hear? When Spanish soldiers entered the Andes in the 1530s, they carried with them more than steel, gunpowder, and disease. They also brought paper, pens, and the conviction that true records required writing in their alphabet. To the conquistadors, the Inca cords seemed primitive, curious objects rather than legitimate documents. A quipu could not bear a royal signature, could not be sealed with wax, could not be read by Europeans without interpreters. And so quipus began to fade, not because they ceased to work, but because a new regime refused to recognize them. The Spanish crown demanded written record censuses in Spanish, tribute tallies on parchment, decrees signed by governors. In some places, quipu kamiok adapted, serving as interpreters between cords and Spanish scribes. They read knots aloud while clerks translated numbers into ink. But as decades passed, the reliance on cords weakened. Many quipus were burned, destroyed by missionaries who saw them as relics of paganism. Others were discarded when they were no longer useful in colonial courts. And yet quipus did not vanish entirely. In remote Andean communities far from colonial centers, people continued to tie knots as memory aids. Local leaders used them to track harvests, marriages, and festivals. Some quipus were incorporated into Christian rituals, reinterpreted rather than erased. Quietly, the practice lingered, even as its imperial scale collapsed. Centuries later, when historians and archaeologists began to study quipus, they encountered puzzles rather than answers. Hundreds of quipus had survived, preserved in dry caves, storerooms, or high-altitude villages. Their cords remained intact, their knots still tied, but their language had been severed from memory. To hold a quipu was to feel the weight of an archive without a key. Scholars began patiently cataloging them, measuring cord lengths, knot placements, and colors. They discovered the use of a decimal system, the hierarchical position of knots representing units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. They noted patterns, groupings, and repetitions. Slowly, the numerical language of the quipu emerged. A census could be read, an inventory reconstructed. But beyond numbers, the meanings grew murkier. Could a sequence of chords represent a story? Could color patterns carry symbolic meaning? The evidence was tantalizing but incomplete. Some researchers believe that quipus functioned much like spreadsheets, efficient tools of administration, nothing more. Others argue that they encoded narratives, pointing to Spanish accounts of quipus being read as histories. Perhaps there were different kinds of quipus, some purely numerical, others mnemonic devices for oral storytelling. Perhaps the chords were never meant to be fully autonomous, but always relied on a human voice to interpret them. This ambiguity makes quipus uniquely haunting. They are artifacts that survived materially but not semantically. The strings remain, but their meaning has unraveled. Unlike manuscripts, which can be deciphered with knowledge of a script, quipus resist easy decoding. They remind us that not all records are preserved equally. Memory requires more than objects. It requires context, community, continuity. Yet even in partial silence, quipus speak. They tell us that the Inca state was neither chaotic nor unsystematic, as colonial writers sometimes suggested. It was precise, organized, and capable of sustaining millions across rugged terrain. Quipus prove that literacy is not the only path to bureaucracy. Knots, chords, and colors could govern as effectively as ink and paper. Today, quipus are housed in museums and archives, studied by mathematicians, anthropologists, and computer scientists alike. Some researchers apply digital analysis, mapping chord patterns with algorithms to search for hidden structures. Others interview Andean communities, seeking traces of memory that might illuminate old practices. The mystery remains unresolved, but each attempt to decode the chords is itself an act of respect and acknowledgement that the Inca's knotted archive deserves recognition. But quipus also resonate beyond scholarship. They challenge how we define knowledge. In a world dominated by alphabets and screens, quipus remind us that memory can be tactile, material, embodied. They ask us to consider whether our own system's databases, spreadsheets, servers will be legible centuries from now, or whether they too will become silent without interpreters. The last quipu keepers are gone, their fingers no longer moving along chords, their voices no longer explaining knots. What remains are threads, mute but stubborn, still carrying the potential for meaning. They are echoes of an empire that trusted chords as its archive, an empire that governed not with parchment but with patience. And so you are left with a reflection. Perhaps the true legacy of the quipu is not in the numbers it once held, but in the reminder that knowledge has many forms. If knots could once sustain an empire, what other ways of recording memory might we overlook today, dismissing them as too simple, too strange, too boring until centuries later, we realize their quiet genius. When you think of walls, you may imagine boundaries, fences around fields, walls around houses, barriers that mark what is inside and what is out. But in China, walls became something much larger. Over centuries, rulers ordered the construction of fortifications so vast that they stretched across mountains, deserts, and plains. Today, you know it as the Great Wall of China. But the Great Wall is not a single wall. It is a network of walls, built and rebuilt over dynasties, patched and extended, rising and crumbling, sometimes abandoned, sometimes restored. It was less a single monument than a continual project, and it demanded endless labor. To stand at the foot of the wall today, gazing at towers cresting mountain ridges, you might think of emperors and armies, of dramatic battles and sweeping vistas. Yet behind the grandeur lies monotony. The wall was built by hands, millions of them. Farmers conscripted from villages, soldiers pressed into construction duty, prisoners punished with endless toil. Their days were filled not with glory but with lifting stones, mixing earth, carrying loads, tamping soil. One brick, one stone, one tamped layer of earth at a time, repeated for months, years, lifetimes. The earliest walls in northern China were not stone at all but earth. During the Warring States period, 475–221 BCE, rival kingdoms built long earthen ramparts to mark their borders and slow the movement of enemies. Workers dug trenches, piled soil, and tamped it firm with wooden tools. The technique was simple but effective: layer upon layer of earth, compacted until it hardened into solid barriers. Imagine the rhythm of this labor: soil carried in baskets, poured into molds, pounded with heavy tamps, dust rising into the air. Nothing about it was glamorous, but mile by mile, walls advanced. When Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, seized power in 221 BCE, he ordered the linking of existing walls into one defensive line. His decree was not a call for inspiration but for labor. Tens of thousands of workers, perhaps hundreds of thousands, were conscripted. Farmers left their fields, soldiers laid aside weapons, convicts were marched to work sites. They lived in rough camps, ate sparse rations, and labored from dawn to dusk. Death was common: exhaustion, disease, accidents, exposure to cold winters. Some accounts claim bodies were buried in the walls themselves, though the evidence is debated. Whether literal or not, the metaphor captures a truth: the wall was built on human lives. The Qin wall was not the end. Later dynasties rebuilt and extended it, sometimes abandoning old sections, sometimes repairing them. The Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, built new walls further north, pushing into deserts. Here, the walls were again made largely of tamped earth, mixed with reeds and brush to strengthen it. Over centuries, wind and sand wore these walls down, yet their outlines still remain, faint scars on the landscape. By the Ming Dynasty, 1368–1644 CE, wall building reached its most monumental scale. The Ming rulers, wary of Mongol incursions, invested heavily in stone and brick fortifications. Workers quarried stone, fired bricks in kilns, and hauled materials up steep mountains. Towers rose at regular intervals, watchtowers for signaling and garrisons. These are the walls most visible today, the ones tourists walk upon. Yet even here, the story is less about imperial grandeur than about ordinary endurance. Each brick was fired, carried, and set by hand. Each tower demanded scaffolding, laborers, and years of effort. Consider a single day in the life of a wall laborer. He wakes before dawn in a rough camp. Breakfast may be a thin gruel of millet. Work begins immediately: hauling stone from a quarry, mixing lime mortar, stacking bricks. The tools are simple: wooden sledges, baskets, ropes. Muscles ache, hands blister, backs bend. The pace is steady, not frantic, because the work is endless. Supervisors enforce order, punish slackers, drive the project forward. By night, the laborer returns to camp, eats little, and collapses onto a mat. Tomorrow will be the same, and the day after, and the year after. This routine was repeated by millions. Records suggest that entire regions were depopulated by conscription during intense phases of construction. Families saw sons and fathers marched away, uncertain if they would return. For peasants, the wall was not a monument to pride but a burden of labor, another demand imposed by distant rulers. And yet, the wall endured because of this very monotony. No single act of heroism built it. It was persistence, repetition, and obedience that laid the stones. The wall was not merely a line of defense. It was also an administrative tool. Gates controlled movement, regulating trade and migration. Soldiers stationed in forts monitored caravans, collected taxes, and enforced order. The wall was less about keeping all enemies out than about channeling flows of people, goods, animals through controlled points. In this sense, the wall was as much about administration as defense. But this bureaucracy, too, relied on routine. Registers were kept, passes issued, inspections conducted. For every soldier standing guard on a tower, there was a clerk tallying numbers in a ledger. And so, behind the image of sweeping fortifications lies a quieter truth. The Great Wall was not one dramatic event but centuries of repetition. It was earth carried in baskets, stones stacked one by one, bricks fired in kilns, mortar mixed in troughs. It was villagers pressed into labor, soldiers dragging loads, prisoners tamping soil under guard. It was supervisors counting, officials recording, dynasties rebuilding. If you think of the wall as a monument, you miss the deeper story. It was, at its core, a process endless, tiring, and often thankless. It shaped landscapes, consumed lives, and defined empires. And yet a question lingers. The wall absorbed so much labor, demanded so much sacrifice, stretched across such distances. But did it truly work? Did all those stones and all those lives achieve their purpose, or did the wall endure more as a symbol than as a shield? To imagine the Great Wall only as a barrier of stone is to see only half its story. For centuries after its construction, it was not just a monument but a place where people lived, worked, and endured. Soldiers garrisoned its towers, administrators collected taxes at its gates, and traders passed through its checkpoints. The wall was less a frozen relic than a living system, quietly woven into the daily fabric of frontier life. At regular intervals, towers rose above the wall. Some were simple watchtowers, square and sturdy, with narrow slits for arrows and fire signals. Others were larger forts, holding garrisons of soldiers. From these posts, soldiers scanned horizons for dust clouds that might signal riders approaching. Communication between towers was achieved with smoke by day, fire by night, and sometimes with drums or flags. Imagine standing on duty in the dead of winter, the wind biting through your clothes, eyes straining across frozen plains. The days were long, the view unchanging. The boredom was broken only by routine patrols and the occasional signal sent to neighboring towers. Life for these soldiers was often monotonous. Supplies had to be brought from far away, so rations were basic: millet gruel, dried vegetables, sometimes meat if livestock were available. Salted food was common, for it lasted through long winters. Soldiers mended their own clothing, tended fires, and practiced drills. For months, perhaps years, many saw no battle. Their work was vigilance, the act of waiting. Some were farmers as well as soldiers, cultivating small plots near the wall to supplement their rations. In summer, they might hoe fields during the day and return to guard duty at night. The wall was not only a fortification but also a place of subsistence. The bureaucracy surrounding the wall was as important as the soldiers. At major passes, officials inspected caravans. Traders brought silk, tea, and porcelain from the Chinese heartland, exchanging them for horses, wool, and furs from the steppe. Each wagon was recorded, each animal counted, each tax collected. Ledgers filled with neat columns, brush strokes marking the flow of goods. For clerks, the wall was not a battlefield but a desk, a daily practice of counting and writing. Their work, too, was repetitive but essential. Villages grew near major sections of the wall, sustained by the presence of soldiers and traders. In served travelers, blacksmiths repaired tools, farmers sold grain. Life along the wall was not glamorous but practical, a frontier existence shaped by the rhythms of military duty and trade. Families lived in the shadow of the wall, their daily routines marked by its presence. Children grew up playing near its stones, perhaps climbing its towers, seeing it not as a monument but as part of their landscape. The wall itself required constant maintenance. Bricks cracked, mortar crumbled, earthen sections eroded in wind and rain. Soldiers and peasants alike were tasked with repairs, carrying baskets of soil, replacing bricks, patching towers. A section left untended could collapse, creating weak points. Maintenance was thus another form of monotony labor repeated year after year, invisible to history but vital to survival. The wall also shaped the way people thought about space. It was not simply a defensive line but a marker of boundaries. To live inside the wall was to be within the empire's order. To live beyond was to be part of the frontier, uncertain and dangerous. Yet these boundaries were never absolute. Trade and exchange continued across the wall, even as officials sought to regulate it. Nomads brought horses and hides. Chinese merchants carried tea and silk. The wall was thus porous, less an impenetrable barrier than a sieve through which life flowed, checked but never fully stopped. For the emperors, the wall was a statement of control. For the people who lived with it, it was a reality of daily life. Soldiers endured boredom and cold. Farmers endured conscription for repairs. Traders endured inspections and taxes. Clerks endured endless columns of numbers. The wall, for them, was not a monument of glory but a structure that demanded their time, labor, and patience. And yet, even with all this vigilance, the wall was not invincible. Raiders still crossed it, bribes opened gates, weak points were exploited. Armies too large to stop sometimes poured through. The wall slowed enemies, channeled them, but could not guarantee security. In some dynasties, its effectiveness was questioned. Was it worth the endless labor, the endless stones, the endless watch? Or was it more symbol than shield, projecting strength even as it failed to fully protect? Here lies the paradox. The wall consumed lives in its construction and maintenance, and yet its success was uncertain. Was the monotony of its upkeep justified by the security it promised? Or was the wall, in truth, an expression of fear, built not because it could guarantee safety but because rulers felt they must be seen to act? For all its length, for all the stones laid and earth tamped, the Great Wall was never invincible. No wall could be. It slowed movement, channeled invaders, and served as a line of watchtowers and passes, but it could not guarantee security. Over centuries, raiders found ways through. Gates could be bribed open, watchmen distracted, and weak sections bypassed. The wall endured physically, but its effectiveness ebbed and flowed with the strength of the dynasty that maintained it. During the Ming Dynasty, the wall reached its most elaborate form. Brick fortifications, stone bastions, crenellated towers, all visible today, were built in response to Mongol pressure. Yet even these fortifications could not hold forever. In the 17th century, the Manchu forces crossed into China, eventually founding the Qing dynasty. Some gates were opened by negotiation, others by betrayal. In the end, the wall could not stop an empire's fall. What followed was neglect. The Qing emperors, secure in their own power, saw less need for constant upkeep. Without soldiers to repair them, sections of the wall crumbled. Bricks were pried away by villagers who used them for houses and pigsties. Earthen walls eroded into ridges of dust. The wall, once a system of defense and administration, faded into the background. For peasants living nearby, it was no longer an imperial frontier but a convenient quarry. For centuries, the wall existed more as ruin than monument, its grandeur forgotten by those who lived beside it. Yet even in decline, the wall carried meaning. Travelers wrote of its vastness, poets described its endurance, and foreign visitors marveled at its scale. It became less a military structure than a symbol, a marker of China's persistence, its ancient strength, and its ability to mobilize human labor on a staggering scale. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as China grappled with foreign invasions and internal upheavals, the wall resurfaced in national consciousness not as defense, but as heritage. In the 20th century, as tourism grew, sections of the Ming Wall near Beijing were restored. Tourists walked along its battlements, gazing across ridges where the wall snaked into distance. For them, it was a monument of wonder. For historians, it was a puzzle of layers. Qin earthworks, hand-tamped soil, Ming bricks, Qing neglect. For locals, it was simply the backdrop of life. The wall meant different things to different people, but to all, it was enduring. Today, the Great Wall is perhaps less a wall than an idea. It is invoked as a symbol of China's resilience, its ability to organize, its long history. Yet the reality remains. The wall was built through monotony, through endless labor, through repetition of simple tasks. Its stones do not speak of emperors alone, but of the hands of laborers, of soldiers waiting in towers, of clerks tallying goods at gates. Its grandeur rests on ordinary endurance. Standing on the wall now, you see tourists taking photos, flags fluttering, vendors selling snacks. But if you pause, you might sense the weight of centuries beneath your feet. Each brick once passed through someone's hands. Each tamped layer of earth was lifted by baskets. Each tower required scaffolding and sweat. The wall is less a miracle of architecture than a monument to persistence. And so the wall leaves you with a question. Was it worth it? The lives lost in construction, the endless years of labor, the burden on villages, did the wall achieve its purpose? Or did it endure mainly as symbol? Perhaps its true legacy lies not in victories or defeats, but in the reminder that history is built, literally, by hands repeating ordinary tasks. What then of our own monumental projects today? Will they be remembered for their triumphs, or for the silent endurance of those who built them? If you picture the Middle Ages, perhaps you think of knights in armor, castles with drawbridges, or kings upon thrones. But much of what we know about that world, indeed, much of what survived of the ancient world itself, was preserved not by warriors or rulers, but by monks with quills, hunched in scriptoria, copying words onto parchment. Their work was tedious, repetitive, and often exhausting. Yet it was in that tedium that civilization's memory was kept alive. A monastery was not only a place of prayer, but also a place of labor. In the Benedictine tradition, monks lived by the motto ora et labora, pray and work. For some, work meant tending fields, brewing ale, or repairing buildings. But for others, work meant copying manuscripts. These monks spent long hours in scriptoria, rooms set aside for writing. Picture a narrow chamber lit dimly by small windows, its walls cold stone, its benches hard. Each monk sat at a desk, parchment before him, quill in hand, inkpot at his side. Around him was silence, broken only by the scratching of quills. The parchment itself was prepared with care. Made from animal skins, usually sheep, goats, or calves, it was scraped, stretched, and smoothed until it became a writing surface. Even this process was laborious. To produce enough parchment for a single manuscript required many animals, much time, and skilled preparation. Once ready, the sheets were ruled with faint lines to guide the writing. Only then could the monk begin to copy. The task of copying was not creative but imitative. A monk's duty was to reproduce faithfully the words of the exemplar before him. Whether it was a biblical text, a work of theology, or a fragment of Roman literature, accuracy mattered more than speed. Mistakes could distort meaning, even doctrine. A slip of the quill might turn a sacred passage into nonsense. To prevent this, monks developed methods of checking, reading aloud as they wrote, having others proofread, and comparing their work to multiple exemplars. Even so, errors crept in, and later generations of scholars have traced the variations. Work was physically taxing. Quills required constant sharpening, ink dried quickly, and parchment resisted smooth writing. Monks often wrote in cramped positions, hunched over for hours. Their hands cramped, their eyes strained, their backs ached. Marginal notes from surviving manuscripts reveal their complaints. The ink is thin, my hand is tired. This parchment is too hairy. One weary scribe scrawled at the end of his work. As the sailor longs for port, so does the scribe for the last line. And yet, despite the boredom, the work mattered. Through this copying, texts survived that might otherwise have been lost forever. When the Western Roman Empire fell, its libraries decayed, its schools collapsed. Much of classical knowledge could have vanished. But in monasteries scattered across Europe, in Ireland, Italy, France, and beyond, monks copied texts again and again. They preserved the works of church fathers like Augustine, but also the writings of Cicero, Virgil, and Aristotle. Without their monotonous labor, the Renaissance centuries later would have had little to rediscover. Scriptoria were not uniform. Some were small, with a few monks working at once. Others, especially in great abbeys, organized larger operations. At Cluny, Monte Cassino, or St. Gall, dozens of monks might work in coordinated effort. Some prepared parchment, others mixed ink, others copied, while yet others illustrated. For though many manuscripts were plain, some were illuminated, decorated with colorful initials, borders, and miniature paintings. These illuminations required separate skills, more artistry than routine, but even they were bounded by discipline and tradition. Ink, too, was part of the rhythm. Made from oak galls, iron salts, and gum arabic, it had to be prepared carefully lest it fade or smudge. The smell of ink, the feel of parchment, the sound of scratching quills all became part of the sensory world of the scriptorium. Days blurred together into cycles of writing, praying, eating, sleeping, and returning again to the desk. Beyond the mechanics, there was purpose. Monks believed that copying sacred texts was itself a form of devotion. To write the Psalms was to pray with one's hand as well as one's voice. The monotony became, in a sense, spiritual discipline. Even when copying secular works, the act was framed as service, to preserve useful knowledge for the glory of God and the benefit of humankind. In this way, the tediousness of the task was given meaning. But life in the scriptorium was not without dangers. Fire, damp, and insects threatened manuscripts. A dropped candle could destroy years of labor. Mice could gnaw parchment. Ink could smudge irreparably. Copying was thus accompanied by vigilance. Manuscripts were stored in armaria, cupboards, or chests, carefully wrapped. The survival of a text was not only a matter of copying it, but of safeguarding it afterward. Think of a single monk, perhaps in a remote Irish monastery during the so-called Dark Ages of Europe, copying by lamplight while storms raged outside. He may not have thought of himself as saving civilization. He was simply performing his duty, line after line. Yet his work carried forward fragments of Homer, fragments of Euclid, fragments of history itself. From such fragments, later centuries rebuilt knowledge. The world beyond the monastery often paid little attention to these labors. Kings fought wars, peasants tilled fields, merchants traded goods. The work of monks with quills was invisible to most. And yet, in the silence of scriptoria, the memory of civilizations endured. And so you may wonder, how many texts were lost despite these efforts? How many works of ancient philosophy, science, or literature were never copied, never preserved, never passed on? What knowledge slipped into oblivion while monks bent over their desks, choosing what was worth saving and what could be left to fade? The scriptorium was not chaos. It was a carefully organized machine, where the slowest of tools, the quill and parchment, were harnessed to serve the survival of knowledge. To step into a great medieval monastery like Cluny in France or Monte Cassino in Italy was to enter not only a house of prayer but a factory of texts, where the hum of prayer blended with the scratching of pens. First came the preparation. Before any copying could begin, parchment had to be produced. Animal skins, once removed from carcasses, were soaked in lime to loosen hair. They were stretched on wooden frames, scraped with knives, and dried taut. The result was vellum smooth, pale, durable. Even this stage demanded patience and skill, for imperfections in parchment could disrupt writing. A hole in the skin might become a gap in the page. A scar could warp the script. Monks who prepared parchment were themselves part of the long chain of preservation. Once parchment was ready, it was ruled. Lines were drawn faintly with a stylus or lead, ensuring neat rows of script. Columns were measured, margins set. Only then did the copying begin. Each monk received an exemplar, the text to be copied, and a stack of blank sheets. Sometimes the exemplar was placed beside him, sometimes read aloud by a lector while several scribes wrote simultaneously. The second method, known as dictation copying, increased efficiency but introduced errors when words were misheard. Even so, the system reflected a balance between speed and accuracy. The act of copying was slow. A skilled scribe might complete a single page in a day, perhaps two if the script was small and plain. A large manuscript, say, a complete Bible, could take years. For this reason, manuscripts were precious. They represented not only knowledge but immense labor. A single book might cost as much as a farm or a small herd of livestock, not because of the materials alone but because of the hours, the lives, invested in it. Errors were inevitable. Eyes tired, attention wavered, words slipped. Some mistakes were corrected with careful scraping of parchment, the ink removed and rewritten. Others were marked in margins. This word was omitted. The exemplar is unclear. Occasionally, scribes added their own voices. Complaints of cold, praise for God, wry remarks about their weariness. These marginal notes remind us that behind the uniform black letters were human beings with cramped hands and wandering thoughts. Not all manuscripts were plain. Some monasteries employed illuminators, monks who specialized in decoration. Using pigments ground from minerals and plants, they painted initials in red, blue, and gold. Borders bloomed with vines, animals, and fantastical creatures. These illuminations were not frivolous but symbolic. Colors carried meaning. Images reinforced text. Yet even illumination had rules, traditions passed down from master to apprentice. A decorated manuscript was not the work of spontaneous art, but of discipline within a framework. The script itself varied by region and century. In early medieval Europe, uncial and half-uncial scripts dominated rounded, simple letters. Later, the Carolingian minuscule, promoted by Charlemagne's reforms, brought clarity and uniformity, making texts more legible. This script influenced much of later European writing. In each case, the style reflected deliberate choices, attempts to impose order on the labor of copying. The scriptoria were not merely preserving texts, but shaping how texts were read and transmitted. Organization extended to subject matter as well. Monasteries chose what to copy, and those choices shaped the canon of Western thought. Biblical texts and commentaries received priority. The writings of Augustine, Jerome, and Gregory the Great filled countless pages. Classical works, Virgil's poetry, Cicero's speeches, Aristotle's philosophy were preserved too, but selectively. Much was lost simply because no one chose to copy it. The machinery of the scriptorium filtered knowledge, preserving what seemed useful or pious, neglecting what seemed irrelevant or dangerous. In this way, the scriptoria were both preservers and gatekeepers. They saved much of what we know of antiquity, but their silence also ensured the loss of much else. Entire plays of Sophocles, treatises of philosophers, and scientific texts of antiquity disappeared, not through deliberate destruction but through neglect. No monk thought them worth the labor of reproduction. The survival of a text thus depended less on its intrinsic value than on the judgment of a scriptorium's librarian. This bureaucratic filtering was invisible to those doing the work. For the monk with his quill, the task was not to decide what was worthy, but to copy what was placed before him. Day after day, he bent over parchment, reproducing lines with care. Yet his labor carried consequences across centuries. By copying Augustine instead of a Roman engineer, he ensured that theology outweighed technology in the medieval curriculum. By illuminating a psalter rather than a mathematical text, he guided the focus of future scholars. The machinery of copying was slow, but its influence immense. Scriptoria also created a culture of standardization. By reproducing texts in uniform script, with consistent margins and divisions, they established conventions that later printers would adopt. The page layout of medieval manuscripts, the columns, the punctuation, the decorated initials shaped the very way readers approached texts. Even the quiet labor of lining parchment with a stylus helped fix the idea of ordered, linear reading. Beyond the mechanics, there was a rhythm of life. A monk might copy for hours, pause for prayer, eat a simple meal, return to his desk, and continue until evening. The cycle repeated day after day, season after season. Winter brought numb fingers and dim light. Summer brought heat and fatigue. But the discipline was steady. In this way, the scriptorium mirrored the monastery as a whole, order, repetition, and devotion woven together. What then was the experience of these monks? Did they feel pride in their work or only exhaustion? Did they sense the weight of history in their hands or only the tedium of repetition? We cannot know for sure. Their marginal notes suggest both frustration and faith, both weariness and conviction. They were ordinary men, caught in a system that demanded extraordinary patience. And here lies the lingering question. If the scriptoria were machines of preservation, what knowledge slipped through their gears? What voices, texts, or ideas were lost because no monk bent over a desk to copy them? For centuries, the scriptoria of Europe had been the quiet engines of preservation, their monks filling libraries with hand-copied manuscripts. But in the 15th century, a new technology arrived that would transform this world forever: the printing press. With movable type, words could be reproduced not slowly, letter by letter, but swiftly, in multiples. A book that might take a monk years to copy could now be printed in weeks, with dozens of identical copies produced. The change was not immediate, but it was irreversible. At first, printed books imitated manuscripts. Printers left spaces for hand-drawn initials, copied medieval page layouts, and even imitated handwriting in typefaces. Some monasteries continued to produce manuscripts, believing them more sacred, more authentic. But gradually, the efficiency of print overwhelmed the patience of quills. By the 16th century, the scriptorium as a central institution had faded. What then became of the manuscripts painstakingly produced by generations of monks? Many found new homes in universities, cathedrals, and princely libraries. Others decayed, forgotten in cupboards or destroyed by fire and damp. Still others were cut apart, their parchment reused for bindings or notes. Yet enough survived that we can glimpse the scale of their work. The very existence of classical texts from Aristotle to Cicero, from Virgil to Boethius, owes itself to the steady copying of monks. The Renaissance, often imagined as a sudden rebirth, was in truth the harvest of seeds sown in the scriptoria. The legacy of the scriptoria was not only textual but also cultural. They shaped the habits of reading and writing in Europe. The uniformity of scripts, the division of texts into chapters and paragraphs, the illumination of initials all became conventions absorbed by print. Even the discipline of proofreading, of comparing copies and correcting errors, began in these silent rooms. The modern book owes much to the monk with his quill. Yet the decline of the scriptorium was also a liberation. No longer tied to the slowness of hand copying, knowledge could spread more widely, more cheaply. Books were no longer treasures limited to monasteries and princes, but goods accessible to merchants, students, and eventually common readers. Literacy expanded, ideas multiplied, debate widened. The silence of the scriptorium gave way to the noise of print shops, the chatter of pamphlets, the arguments of scholars. And yet, one should not forget the centuries that came before. The printing press did not appear in a vacuum. It drew upon the reservoir of texts preserved by patient hands. Without the long centuries of copying, there would have been little for printers to print. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution all drew upon manuscripts painstakingly preserved in monastic cupboards. The monks who grumbled about cold fingers and thin ink unwittingly prepared the ground for revolutions of thought. Today, when you hold a modern book, you rarely think of those who copied its ancestors by hand. Yet in the faint traces of script, in the survival of rare texts, in the continuity of learning, their labor endures. The margins filled with tiny notes, the illuminations glowing with gold, the careful lines of uniform script, all are testimonies to centuries of monotony transformed into cultural survival. The scriptorium, then, was both a place of boredom and a place of salvation. Its monks were not heroes in the conventional sense, but preservers, caretakers of memory. They chose what to copy, sometimes deliberately, sometimes by chance. Their choices shaped what was remembered and what was lost. And so you might ask yourself, in an age where words are reproduced instantly, what will be preserved and what will vanish? Will the abundance of information ensure survival, or will it drown memory in excess? The monks with quills remind us that knowledge survives not only through creation but through care, patience, and the willingness to copy line after line, even when no glory is attached. Long before parchment, before paper, before quills scratched across vellum, there was clay. In the river valleys of Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, people pressed reeds into wet clay, leaving wedge-shaped impressions. These marks, baked in the sun or in kilns, hardened into tablets that could last for millennia. The script they created, called cuneiform, was among the earliest systems of writing. The origins of writing here were not lofty. It was not invented first to tell stories or compose poetry. It was born of bureaucracy. Around 3200 BCE, city-states like Uruk and needed to track goods, grain in storehouses, sheep in pens, beer distributed for rations. Oral memory was not enough for growing populations. Officials required durable records, proof of obligations, lists of commodities, tallies of tribute. Clay, abundant in the river valleys, offered the perfect medium. A scribe sat with a lump of wet clay, smoothing it flat into a tablet. With a sharpened reed stylus, he pressed small marks, triangles, wedges, strokes. At first, the signs were pictographs, a drawing of a sheep to mean sheep, a jar to mean beer. Over time, these signs became more abstract, more standardized, until they formed a system of hundreds of characters. To read them required training, but once mastered, they could record almost anything. Numbers, names, transactions, even hymns and laws. The work of the scribe was painstaking. He sat cross-legged, tablet in hand, stylus poised. Each mark required steady pressure, each line carefully placed. A tablet might record a list of sheep delivered to a temple, or the number of jars of oil distributed to workers. The details were dull but vital. Without such records, administrators could not track tribute, priests could not oversee offerings, merchants could not balance accounts. Writing, at its birth, was a tool of control. Clay tablets piled up in archives. Temples, palaces, and storehouses filled with shelves of hardened records. Some tablets were tagged with seal impressions, rolled with carved cylinders that left intricate designs, symbols of authority. A seal pressed into clay was a signature, a mark of authenticity. Bureaucracy gained weight not in parchment but in baked earth. The scribes themselves formed a class. They were trained in scribal schools, memorizing signs, practicing with styluses, learning to write quickly and neatly. Education was rigorous, requiring years of repetition. To become a scribe was to join an elite, one of the few who could interpret the wedge marks. Ordinary laborers could not read the tablets that recorded their rations. Only scribes and officials could. Writing, in this sense, was power. And yet, for all its authority, the work of the scribe was monotonous. A ration list might read, 10 measures of barley to worker A, 10 measures of barley to worker B, 10 measures of barley to worker C, line after line, tablet after tablet, day after day. The precision mattered. A single miswritten number could disrupt accounts, cause disputes, even bring punishment. Accuracy, not creativity, was the demand. Over centuries, cuneiform expanded beyond numbers and lists. Scribes recorded contracts, laws, treaties, hymns, and myths. The famous Code of Hammurabi, inscribed around 1750 BCE, was written in cuneiform. So too were the Epic of Gilgamesh and countless prayers to the gods. But even these grand texts were written by scribes trained first in the dull routines of bureaucracy. The art of writing grew from the habit of counting sheep. Clay had advantages and disadvantages. It was cheap, abundant, and durable. Tablets left in dry conditions could last thousands of years, but clay was heavy, fragile when wet, and awkward to transport. A single archive might contain tens of thousands of tablets, each small and hard to handle. To consult them required patience, sorting, and storage. The bureaucracies of Mesopotamia thus developed systems for organizing tablets, shelves, labels, catalogues. The act of keeping records became as important as the act of writing them. For the people who lived under this system, the tablets were invisible. A farmer delivering grain to a temple might see a scribe recording the delivery, but the marks meant nothing to him. A laborer receiving his ration of beer might trust the tally, but he could not verify it. Writing was not for the masses but for administrators. It was a technology of accountability, but accountability flowed upward, not downward. Still, one can imagine the daily rhythm of a scribe in Uruk. He enters the temple storehouse in the morning, clay tablets stacked nearby. Merchants arrive, priests supervise offerings, workers line up for rations. Each exchange requires a record. The scribe moistens clay, flattens it, presses marks. The process is repetitive but steady. By evening, dozens of tablets join the archive. Tomorrow, more will follow. The city hums, and its hum is preserved in clay. If you walk through a museum today and see rows of cuneiform tablets behind glass, you may be struck by their uniformity. They look like bricks covered in tiny, orderly scratches. But behind those scratches lay the machinery of an early civilization. Each wedge was a number, each line a name, each tablet a piece of the bureaucracy that held cities together. And so you may wonder, when writing begins with lists and tallies, with sheep and barley and beer, what does that say about the origins of knowledge? Was writing always destined to become literature and law, or did it begin, and perhaps always remain at its heart, as a tool of control and administration? By the time the city-states of Mesopotamia had matured into kingdoms and empires, the simple tally marks of early Uruk had evolved into a dense and flexible writing system. Hundreds of signs, thousands of combinations, endless possibilities. Cuneiform had become the bureaucracy's most reliable servant. It was no longer just sheep and barley, it was law codes, contracts, treaties, letters, hymns, and royal decrees. What began in wet clay, as counting grew into an entire world of administration. In cities like Lagesh, and Babylon, scribes were everywhere. They recorded the decrees of kings, the judgments of courts, the inventories of temples. They drafted contracts for marriage, adoption, land sale, and loans. They wrote letters on clay tablets, sealed with cylinder seals that left intricate images when rolled across the soft surface. Even the personal affairs of households, dowries, inheritances, apprenticeships were embedded in the bureaucratic clay. Writing had spread far beyond the temple storehouse. It now governed life itself. At the center of this expansion was the scribe. To become a scribe was to join an elite class, educated in long and difficult training. The tablet house, or edubba, was the school where boys learned the signs. They practiced endlessly on clay, copying lists of words, proverbs, and mathematical problems. Teachers corrected mistakes, sometimes harshly. Students were disciplined, required to memorize long lists of signs and their meanings. For years, their lives were filled with drills until they could write fluently. The monotony was intense, but at its end lay prestige. A scribe might serve in a temple, a palace, or a court. He could expect steady employment and social respect. Daily work was not glamorous. A scribe might spend the morning drafting contracts. So-and-so sells a field to so-and-so for such and such amount of silver. Another tablet might record a loan. So-and-so borrows 10 measures of barley to be repaid after harvest. Each contract required precision. Names, amounts, dates, witnesses. Mistakes could cause disputes, so every line was checked, every seal pressed firmly. The scribe's work was not art, it was bureaucracy. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the most famous legal texts in history, was itself a product of this culture. Carved into stone around 1750 BCE, its laws were also recorded and copied on clay tablets. The code listed rules about property, contracts, wages, punishments, and social status. If a man puts out the eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. If a builder constructs a house that collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. These rules were severe, but they reflected a society deeply invested in written order. A law was not truly law until it was inscribed, visible, fixed. Clay made authority tangible. But the clay bureaucracy was not only about punishment. It was also about organization. Taxes were collected in grain, animals, and silver. Temples oversaw vast estates with fields, workers, and herds. Palaces demanded tribute from conquered regions, and armies needed supplies. To manage these flows, scribes recorded deliveries, disbursements, and quotas. One tablet might list the rations for workers on a canal project. Barley, oil, and beer distributed daily. Another might tally the herds belonging to a temple. How many ewes, how many lambs, how many oxen. These lists seem dull, but they were the lifeblood of the state. Without them, armies could not march, canals could not be dug, and temples could not function. Clay was unforgiving in its own way. Unlike parchment or paper, which could be corrected with scraping or blotting, clay demanded precision. Errors required smoothing and rewriting, or discarding the tablet altogether. This meant scribes worked carefully, pressing each wedge deliberately. The physicality of the medium shaped the mentality of the bureaucracy. Records were solid, durable, and visible. Once dried or baked, they could not easily be altered. Authority was literally baked into clay. Yet this durability also produced archives of staggering size. Excavations in Mesopotamia have uncovered tens of thousands of tablets from single sites. In the city of Mari, an archive of more than 20,000 tablets recorded the correspondence of kings and officials. In Nineveh, the library of Ashurbanipal contained over 30,000 tablets, including myths, omens, and scientific texts. To walk into such an archive must have been overwhelming. Shelves stacked with heavy tablets, each inscribed with tiny wedges, each carrying the voice of bureaucracy. For the ordinary people of Mesopotamia, the clay bureaucracy was both a burden and a shield. Contracts formalized marriages, but also bound them tightly. Loans gave access to resources, but default could mean debt slavery. Taxes supported the state, but they weighed heavily on farmers. Writing gave authority to agreements, but also left little room for flexibility. In this sense, the bureaucrats of clay shaped not only the economy but also daily life, embedding rules in hard, unyielding form. The monotony of scribal work persisted through centuries. Dynasties rose and fell, empires expanded and collapsed, but scribes continued pressing reeds into clay. Their tablets record not only the grand events of kings, but the ordinary flow of daily life. We know the price of beer in Babylon, the wages of workers in Ur, the rations of laborers on royal projects, not because poets sang of them, but because scribes recorded them in clay. It is boring history, but it is also the foundation of civilization. And yet here lies the question: did writing liberate or did it bind? Was cuneiform a gift of knowledge or a tool of control? When every loaf of bread, every jar of beer, every measure of grain is tallied and sealed, is society more secure or more constrained? For nearly 3,000 years, the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform recorded the pulse of Mesopotamian life. Dynasties shifted, languages changed, but the script endured. Sumerian gave way to Akkadian, Akkadian to Babylonian and Assyrian, yet scribes continued to press reeds into clay. Empires fell, temples crumbled, but archives of baked tablets remained, tucked away in storerooms and palaces. Few writing systems in history lasted so long. But even cuneiform had its limits. By the first millennium BCE, the world was changing. Aramaic, written on parchment with ink, spread widely as a simpler, faster script. Clay was durable but heavy, cumbersome, and labor-intensive. A letter inscribed on clay required a tablet, a stylus, and careful drying. A letter on parchment required only ink and pen. For bureaucracies that needed speed, parchment proved more efficient. Slowly, cuneiform declined. By the time of the Hellenistic and Roman periods, the knowledge of the script had dwindled. By around the 1st century CE, the last scribes of cuneiform were gone. For nearly 2 millennia, the wedge marks lay silent. Travelers who saw them carved into ruins had no idea what they meant. Some thought them decorative, others guessed they were symbolic. The voices of Mesopotamian kings, merchants, and scribes had fallen mute. The clay records, once so authoritative, became unreadable relics. Civilization had moved on, and the script of the first bureaucrats of clay was forgotten. It was only in the 19th century that cuneiform began to speak again. Archaeologists digging in Mesopotamia uncovered vast archives: the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, the tablets of Mari, the records of Ur. Scholars carried these tablets to Europe, where philologists puzzled over their markings. The breakthrough came with the decipherment of old Persian inscriptions, which used cuneiform signs. Gradually, scholars pieced together Akkadian, Sumerian, and Babylonian. What had been mute scratches became words once more. The rediscovery was not only of epic tales like the Epic of Gilgamesh, but also of the dullest tablets, ration lists, receipts, contracts, inventories. These revealed the true character of Mesopotamian writing. Yes, there was poetry and myth, but beneath it lay bureaucracy. The majority of tablets were not literature but ledgers. Civilization had been carried forward on the back of administrative monotony. The survival of clay makes this uniquely clear. Unlike parchment, which decays, clay endures. Fires that destroyed cities often baked tablets harder, preserving them. In the ruins of temples and palaces, tablets lay waiting for millennia. Today, they tell us more about Mesopotamian daily life than any other source. We know how much grain workers received, how taxes were assessed, how canals were maintained not because anyone thought these details glamorous, but because scribes wrote them down, day after day, in clay. What do these records show us? They reveal a civilization deeply invested in order, in accountability, in control. Kings proclaimed their greatness on monuments, but their power rested on tablets that recorded deliveries of barley, distributions of beer, lists of conscripts. The ordinary made the extraordinary possible. Without the monotonous tallying of scribes, there could be no armies, no palaces, no ziggurats. For the scribes themselves, what did it mean? Did they think of their work as dull necessity or as participation in the divine order? In Mesopotamia, writing was sacred. Nabu, the god of writing, was revered, and scribes saw themselves as his servants. To press wedges into clay was not only administration, but also a sacred act. Their monotony was given meaning by its divine frame. Even in routine, they believed they were upholding cosmic order. And yet, when the last scribe died, their world fell silent. For centuries, no one could read their tablets. Their bureaucracy, once so vital, became incomprehensible. What is bureaucracy without readers? What is memory without interpreters? The rediscovery of cuneiform in the modern age is a reminder that knowledge is fragile, even when carved in clay. Today, tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets rest in museums and archives around the world. Scholars study them, digitize them, translate them. But millions more remain buried, their marks unseen, their voices still unheard. Each tablet is a frozen moment of bureaucratic life, a delivery made, a debt recorded, a law proclaimed. Together, they form a chorus of the ordinary, the hum of administration that sustained one of humanity's first civilizations. The bureaucrats of clay leave us with a sobering reflection. Our own records, stored in digital servers, may seem more advanced, but will they survive 3,000 years as clay has? Or will they vanish when electricity fails, when formats become obsolete, when memory fades? The clay tablets endured because they were simple, physical, and dull. Perhaps there is a lesson in their monotony. And so, you are left to wonder, in 1,000 years, what will remain of our bureaucracies? Will future archaeologists find our records legible, or will our civilization fall as silent as the wedge marks once did?